Thank you, Madam President. The circumstances that we face today in the Senate are so disturbing. This is really, really unbelievable. I mean, there's so much good news out there on the health care front, on the pandemic front, on the economic front. But what we're going to do in this chamber is absolutely appalling. The members of this chamber came together 5 times last year and passed overwhelmingly bipartisan bills to deal with this pandemic, to deal with the economic crisis that came from the lockdown that we experienced 5 times. About $4 trillion, completely unprecedented in scope and scale, the nature of it, never imagined before. But we did it. We did it because we needed to, and we came together. I think the biggest of the bills passed, the biggest by far, without a single no vote in this whole chamber. Completely bipartisan. So President Biden gets elected, gives a great speech, great inaugural speech about uniting the country, coming together. We don't have to be divided the way we have been. We can work together and find common ground. So 10 Republican senators go down to the White House and say, well, Mr. President, I know you'd like to do 1.9 trillion, whatever it is, but we think there's a good case for $600 billion. Now, I don't happen to agree with those 10 Republican senators as it happens. I don't think that even that is appropriate, but they did. And the reason that's significant is because there were 10 of them, which just so happens to be exactly the minimum number needed of Republican senators to join with the Democrats to pass anything they want on a bipartisan basis. So there, handed to him on a silver platter, to the president, was the opportunity to do a bipartisan bill to figure out where that common ground was. The Republicans were offering to negotiate from there. This probably could have easily ended at $1 trillion or so after just weeks before passing a $1 trillion bill. The president could have gotten so much of what he wanted, but President Biden didn't want any part of that. And you got to ask yourself, why is that? When he campaigned as the guy who's going to unify America, and he had every Republican vote he needed sitting in his office asking him to work this out, and he said, no, not interested. Effectively, that's what he said. Well, when you look at the bill, it's clear why President Biden chose this path. Because there's no justification for this bill. There's no medical justification. There's no pandemic justification. There's no economic justification. This isn't about coming together and doing something about a crisis. This is about a partisan left-wing wish list. And of course, Republicans aren't interested in that kind of political gesturing that's going to do economic damage. I'm reminded of the words of Rahm Emanuel, who famously said, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. Rahm Emanuel must be very proud of our Democratic colleagues and President Biden, because what they've done is they've taken a crisis that's rapidly receding, let's be honest, and they've decided this is their chance to make one last mad dash for the door with a staggering amount of money and presumably claim credit for the recovery that's already well underway. The good news is there's a lot of good news, right? We went through one of the most trying times we've been through in a very long time in this country. This pandemic was devastating, it was deadly, it was scary, and the economic crisis was very, very real. But now, we've got over 100 million doses of vaccines have gone into people's arms. When you figure that we might very well have 100 million Americans who've had the disease and recovered, we've got to have well over half of the American population has either recovered or been vaccinated, is therefore no longer at risk to this disease, not at a significant risk. And that's fantastic news. And by the way, the vaccine administration is accelerating. And so following that, we are unsurprisingly seeing this terrific collapse in the number of new cases. The daily count of new cases of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, peaked at around 250,000 new cases in a single day. We were running at that pace. By the time we got to the inauguration of President Biden, we were down to 185,000, and yesterday it was about 60,000. So less than a quarter of the number of new cases on a daily basis that we were experiencing at the peak, and it continues to drop. It's going to continue to decline, probably very rapidly, as we continue to roll out these vaccines. That's terrific. And there is a sort of parallel recovery of the economy underway. If you go back to April of 2020, when it was at its worst, the unemployment rate was almost 15%, 14.8. That's a terrible, terrible unemployment rate. As of January of this year, just a few months ago, the unemployment rate was 6.3, less than half where we were. Now, we're not back to the fantastic economy we had a year ago, just before this pandemic broke, but we're getting there. And 18 states across the country have unemployment rates below 5%. So we're going to get there. The economy is growing. After a collapse in the second quarter of last year, the third quarter came roaring back. And the fourth quarter grew, and Congressional Budget Office thinks that this whole calendar year of 2021, our economy will grow almost 5%. Most private economists think more than that, and there's a lively debate about whether we'll even reach 6 or 7 or more percent growth. We were told never again to expect to see 3. But that's how strong this economic recovery is, because of the resiliency of the American people, the tremendous ingenuity of the private sector to come up with vaccines that are incredibly effective, several of them, and do it in a record time. I mean, a fraction of what was the previous record time. It's amazing. And yeah, you know what? We played a role in this too. I think we did. The bipartisan cooperation in Congress to pass one bill after another on a huge scale. Like I said, 5 bills. The biggest without a single dissenting. Actually, I'm not sure any of them had a dissenting vote in the Senate. And almost $1 trillion in December, leaving tens of billions of dollars that we've approved that hasn't even been spent yet. No, the intended beneficiaries have not gotten the money yet. It takes a little while to get the money out the door. So given this context, given this history, this is why it's so dispiriting to see our Democratic colleagues insisting on a bill that has almost nothing to do with COVID. That's the truth. It is not about reopening the economy. It's a partisan left-wing spending binge. That's what it is. Let's take a look at some of the individual items. We've got these so-called stimulus checks. I never heard anything more inaptly named. $414 billion. The fact is, real personal income in the country is today higher than it was just before the pandemic. Disposable real per capita income rose at its highest rate since 1984. Personal savings rate hit an all-time record high in 2020. Why? Because we more than replaced lost income through all of the bills that we passed. So what about that data suggests we need another round of universal payments to people? It's not going to stimulate the economy. Even the last check, 60% of that money went to savings accounts or paying down debt. According to a Penn Wharton study, about 75% of these checks are going to go into savings. And why in the world are we sending so many checks to tens of millions of people who've never had any lost income? So under this bill, the federal government's going to send out $5,600 to a family of 4, $5,600 to a family of 4 that makes $150,000 a year and never had a dime of income lost. No interruption of income, no loss of income. They're going to get $5,600. And that, by the way, that's on top of the $5,800 they already got last year. With no need, no demonstrated problem here. $11,400 of money that we don't have that we're going to send to people who've never had a dime of lost income. That's a big chunk. of this bill. But it may not be the worst. It may be that the worst is the $350 billion we're going to send to state and local governments to bail out the mismanaged blue states and cities. And the amazing thing is, you can't possibly make the case that they need the bailout. They don't even need it. Why do I say that? Well, if you look in 2020, the books are closed now. We know what we didn't know early in the year of 2020. We're in 2021 now. We know what happened in 2020. And what happened was states and municipalities in the aggregate brought in more revenue in 2020 than they did in 2019, which was a record year. So they've set an all-time new record for tax revenue collected. All-time new record. And that does not include the $500 billion we sent them anyway. I mean, these states are loaded with cash. I don't know what they're going to do with it. There's $60 billion in rainy day funds. We heard, oh my goodness, these states are going to have to cut essential services. All the teachers are going to be laid off. The firemen and the police officers, that's all done. How is that when they've taken in more revenue than they ever have before in their history? And then we sent them another $500 billion. So now we're going to send them yet another $350 on top of this? How does this make any sense at all? We're going to go out and borrow or print this money so that we can send it to a bunch of states, many of whom are sitting on so much cash, they're going to, I don't know, probably cut taxes. It's just unbelievable. Then there's the Obamacare expansion. What does that have to do with COVID? This is just a decade-long goal of our Democratic colleagues to continue the endless expansion of Obamacare. So, $45 billion in this bill to pay insurance companies more money to cover people who already have health insurance. That's what they're doing. 63% of these new subsidies will go to people who already have health insurance through Obamacare. And by the way, it includes huge numbers of people that make over $100,000 a year. Never miss a chance to make more people dependent on government. It's got policies, big policies, that will absolutely slow the economic recovery. So let me be clear. This bill will slow down the economic recovery underway. Why do I say that? Well, the bill insists on adding $400 a week on top of whatever states are paying in unemployment benefits. Well, what does that mean? It means that more than half of everyone who's unemployed is going to get paid more not to work than they get paid working. Who could even think this up? We've had unemployment insurance for decades in this country. We have never said, let us systematically make sure that people can make more money not working than they can make if they go to work. I hear some of my colleagues talk a lot about the dignity of work. I think there's a lot of dignity in work. What is our message to people about the dignity of work when we say, you know, you're worth more to us sitting on the couch than you are at your job? That's what this is. It's a terrible idea. And how do you know for sure that nobody on the other side is even pretending that this is really about the economic recovery? Well, you know for sure because the Congressional Budget Office has told us that only a small fraction of this money is even going to be spent this year. How long do we think the pandemic is going to be with us as a pandemic? How long do we think we're going to have these lockdowns? We're going to be out of the woods pretty soon here. Well, as I said, we've got half of all Americans have been either vaccinated or recovered from this. But the school number is a good illustration, the elementary and secondary education. This bill has $128 billion. $128 billion. $6.5 billion is going to be spent in 2021. The rest gets dribbled out for years and years and years. How long do they think before schools can reopen? Oh, and by the way, this bill doesn't require the schools to reopen. You don't even have to reopen. You just throw billions and billions and billions of dollars at schools, whether or not they're actually having kids in the school. And some of these provisions are so blatantly unrelated to COVID or the economy It's really just hard to even read them with a straight face. $86 billion to bail out multi-employer pension plans without any reform whatsoever. Now look, we all know we have a multi-employer pension problem in this country, and there's been a lot of discussion about what do you do about these grossly underfunded pension plans, and how do you fix this? And the conversation has always been what kind of reforms come with what kind of cash so that these errors of the past are corrected. There's no reforms here, none, nothing, just a big pile of cash. It's a clear message that you don't have to fix anything, you don't have to reform the flaws of these programs that got us here. And by the way, it's the same message to the insolvent public pension plans of most of the major cities and many states. Don't worry, look what Congress will do, and if the Democrats have their way, they'll just send you so much cash, you don't have to worry about the insolvency you're dealing with. What a terrible message. $270 million for the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. Oh, that's COVID-related. Thank goodness that's there. $91 million for outreach to student loan borrowers. I don't even know what that means. $50 million for environmental justice grants. I have no idea what that means. But this one is really rich. There's about $4 billion for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. I say about $4 billion because it says such sums as may be necessary. And here's what the money is for. It's going to pay off 120% of the debt of these farmers and ranchers. 120% of the borrowings. So what in the world are the requirements to have 120% of your debt paid off? Well, you actually have to have debt, okay? So you have to have borrowed money from the USDA farm loan. There's tens of billions of dollars out there. They lend a lot of money. And you have to be a member of one of the following groups: African American, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, Hispanic, Pacific Islanders, refugees, or immigrants. As long as you're in one of those categories of racial and ethnic, mostly racial and ethnic groups, then the taxpayer is going to pay off 120%, not the whole loan, more than the whole loan, 120%. And the thing that's so disturbing about this is that the essential criteria is your skin color. The essential criteria is your race. This is unbelievable to me. By the way, there's no income test. There's no asset test for the underlying loans. There's no requirement whatsoever that COVID caused any problem, caused any lost income, or any other problem. It's not mentioned. So what's the effect of this? This means that if you have a wealthy Hispanic rancher who's got $1 million loan from the USDA, he's going to get $1.2 million. He can pay off the loan and $200,000 to do with whatever he likes. And meanwhile, if you're a poor white farmer in rural Pennsylvania and you have a $100,000 loan, you get nothing, exactly nothing. How is that even remotely fair? I don't know how that could even be constitutional. But it's certainly not in any way COVID-related. There was an amendment in the House that would have limited the payment. It would allow the program, which I object to, but it would allow this repayment of debt, but only for debt incurred during the COVID crisis. Democrats all voted that down. That failed. This is unbelievable stuff. Even the provisions that purport to be about public health are completely divorced from any reality. As I think I mentioned earlier, we're administering almost 2 million doses of vaccines every day now. That's terrific. It's actually the highest daily rate of doses administered anywhere in the world. The government has already purchased 700 million doses. Now, we've got less than 350 million Americans, and not all Americans are going to need 2 doses. So you can do the math. We have bought more vaccine doses than we need to administer. That's fine. But how many more do you need to buy? when you've already bought more than enough for every single American? And that's not all we paid for. Through the previous bills that we passed, we paid for the research and development, we paid for the production, we paid for the transportation, we paid for all the accompanying supplies like syringes and the vials and the dry ice. We paid for all that, and we should have. That was the right thing to do. Insurance covers the cost of the administering of the vaccines between Medicare and Medicaid and private insurance. It's free. What is left to spend money on? I'm all ears, but I haven't heard what we need to spend money on. So what do we have in this bill? We have no justification for it in terms of public health. We certainly have no justification for it in terms of the economy. We certainly have no justification in terms of basic fairness. And frankly, it's going to do more harm than good. But you don't have to take my word for it. We could take the word of prominent liberal Democrat economists. Larry Summers. He was the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. He was the director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. And he said, and I quote, about this bill, macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation, end quote. Or consider the words of Steve Ratner, who's a liberal economist. President Obama named him the car czar. You may recall him administering that program. He said, and I quote, the American Rescue Plan, that's apparently what they call this, he said, the American Rescue Plan is also partly a legislative Trojan horse, an enormous aid package aimed at addressing needs that in some cases go well beyond the immediate challenges of COVID. Some of the most expensive provisions are the least well targeted to help the neediest, end quote. And that's from a liberal Democrat who I think supports the bill. But at least he's being honest in his description of it. So, Madam President, my suggestion, my plea to my Democratic colleagues, to the new president, listen to some of the things you've said. Try an approach that's actually informed by the facts on the ground, the health facts, the economic facts, the reality. Look at what the science is currently telling us about the course that this virus has been taking. And what about actually attempting to bring people together, the path of unity, after we demonstrated 5 times last year that we can work together and do something on a bipartisan basis? I urge my colleagues, don't push through this radically partisan bill that will probably, in the end, do more harm than good. And I yield the floor.